Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined by Dr. Rachel Coleman. Dr. Coleman, how are you doing?
I'm all right.
Awesome. Well, just to introduce you for the audience, Dr. Rachel Coleman is an assistant professor of theology at Assumption University in Massachusetts. She received a BA in philosophy and a BS in biology from DeSales University in Pennsylvania, and a MA in theological studies with a concentration in biotechnology and ethics, as well as a PhD in theology from the John Paul II Institute in Washington, D.C., both those from the JP2 Institute. Her main area of writing and research is metaphysics, though she also writes at the intersection of science, philosophy, and theology. Dr. Cohen, it's great to have you on the show. I read your article from the New Resource Small. I also read the one in Communio on matter. Um, and I was very interested. So I went ahead and read through your New Resource Small article a few times, highlighted some stuff, and took some notes. And if that's okay with you, I'd like to kind of dive into it and maybe open up the gist of what you were saying in light of Ferdinand Ulrich. Um, so maybe to kick things off, could you tell us more about Martin Heidegger? If someone's new and they're wondering who's this German philosopher from the 1900s, I think early 20th century as well, right?
hmm
Could you tell us more about Martin Heidegger?
Yeah. So I'm not, to be super clear for your audience, I'm not a Heidegger scholar. However, the article that you're referring to that was published in the New Resource Mont last year
Yeah.
is entitled "How Is It with the Nothing," which is a kind of famous quote from Heidegger's a famous lecture Heidegger gave called "What is Metaphysics." I'm sure we'll get into that in a little bit later. But the reason I wrote that article I entitled it "How Is It with the Nothing," is I am an Ulrich scholar, and such as it is, I guess. And one of the philosophers that Ulrich engages with a lot throughout his work, but especially in his kind of main work or first work, which is called Homo Vicis, is Heidegger. Hegel as well, but Heidegger a lot. So I just want to make it clear, I'm not a Heidegger scholar, but I will do my best to introduce Heidegger. So Heidegger was a German philosopher. He was born in, I think, the 1890s in Germany. And I mean, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that he profoundly affected philosophy, especially Western philosophy. Like it wasn't the same after Heidegger for a lot of reasons. He's not without problem, that's for sure. But he grew up in a Catholic family, and even went to seminary actually, but then decided to leave not just seminary but the faith altogether. Precisely because he thought, and we actually have a letter that he wrote to, I think, his seminary director about why he was not just leaving seminary, but leaving the church. Yeah. And he decided to leave because essentially because he thought that one could not think within what he would call like the confines of the tradition. Yeah. Essentially, that these were like limits on his thinking. So, I mean, on the one hand, obviously, I would disagree with that, and I think it's wrong-headed. But on the other hand, you can see, at the very least, what that shows us is how seriously Heidegger wanted to take thinking and thinking about being specifically. So he ended up getting a position at the University of Freiburg, and he had a lot of famous students, Hans Jonas, Hannah Arendt, Ada Stein. He himself was a student of Husserl. So there's kind of a genealogy there of sort of
phenomenology.
Yes, exactly. And then he his main, well, there's a lot of people who they divide Heidegger up into like early Heidegger and middle Heidegger and late Heidegger, and his first main work was called Being and Time, and he's asking the question of what he calls Dasein. So that's his kind of name for the being of human beings. Da in German means like there, and Sein means being. And so for him, human being, what he calls is their being, by which I think he means human being is the being that can kind of think forward and see like its own end. And then therefore that sort of being able to see its own end is a kind of transcendence, and sort of makes us realize like we have an end, and therefore like we're in something bigger than ourselves. And that's why I think Being in Time is called Being in Time, because we're the being that can kind of think time, right? We're the being that can think over there. He's very concerned, I think, throughout his career about the loss of a sense of being, and a loss of really contemplation. And he thinks that philosophy has been kind of overtaken by what he calls Roman thought, and by which he means thought that kind of brings something into line. Like I bring a thing into line with my own thinking rather than letting my thinking be shaped by the thing that I'm beholding, basically. So he's also very, so one of the big questions throughout his career is what is metaphysics, actually. He has a lecture called What is Metaphysics, but then he returns to that lecture throughout his career. And he ends up having the lecture, he ends up writing a postscript later, like many years later. And then he also ends up writing, many years after that, writing an introduction to What is Metaphysics. So it's clear this question is on his mind. And so I say all this just to get to kind of what people call the later Heidegger, where at the end, Heidegger says, like, even asking the question, what is metaphysics, or even doing metaphysics is constraining to being. So to me, at least at the beginning of his career, he wanted to really sort of rethink metaphysics and rethink being. But at the end, he seems to go in a very, like, what I would call mystic direction, and say, like, even to use the term being is to constrain this great mystery that we're all in. And so he's hesitant to even do that. So he ends up doing this thing where he, when he publishes being, he publishes the word being, but then there's like an X through it, which is like very funny to me. But he's like trying to get us to see, like, this is not a concept, right? It's something more than that. So yeah, that would be my little like spiel about Heidegger right at the beginning.
No, that's great. In a certain way, reminds me of Maurice Blondel. I've been reading I've been reading about Blondel recently. Oliva Blanchette has a massive biography. Yeah. Oh, it's fantastic. I'm almost done with it. But Blondel is very much, the experience of the willing will and the willed will and action and this kind of phenomenology that doesn't want to get stuck in notional knowing, but in real knowing. It sounds a lot like Heidegger, but the difference, it's also kind of the opposite, because Blondel seems to be actually trying to retrieve these sources of the tradition to respond to, people like Spinoza and Hegel. So that I find that really interesting, the similarities there. And they probably lived around the same time. As you were talking, I remembered like Heidegger got embroiled with the whole Nazi controversy as well, right?
Yeah. I was leaving that off.
I probably shouldn't have brought that up. Sorry. Yeah.
No. I mean, because there's like a whole, again, not being a Heidegger scholar myself, right? But knowing that there's this whole question, right? Because as I said at the beginning, I don't think you could say philosophy or even theology is the same after Heidegger. Like the questions that he poses are so profound and so radical that they sort of have to be answered. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. But they do have to be answered. And for that, I'm grateful. right? And in a way, I think both the philosophical tradition and the theological tradition should be grateful to him.
Yeah.
On the other hand, yes, he was embroiled with the Nazis, and there was like what are called the Black Notebooks that were published, fairly recently. Where there was some questions before the Black Notebooks were published about like, well, how much did he really believe in all this? Whereas like after the Black Notebooks were published, it was
pretty clear.
Yeah,
but bringing that up, my intention wasn't to kind of use it to, because your article shows that there's a real experience in Heidegger and some very important questions that ought to be taken very seriously, and he does kind of make a difference that's extremely significant. So I just bring that up as a kind of trivia point. But so another thing that I've heard about Heidegger is his critique of he wants to move kind of in a Cartesian way, wants to step out of the stream of the tradition, and he kind of labels. You said he's opposed to Roman thinking, but also he has this term that I've heard people use before, which is ontotheology, and I think different people mean different things. I think for him it's a multifaceted thing, if my understanding's right. And but one aspect of it is this kind of objectifying of a reality of beings. Maybe before I ask you more about that, I'm just going to read a quote from your article very briefly here. So you write, in metaphysics, we have more or less lost the ability really to think because we objectify, that is, make into an object, anything that we interrogate. So Heidegger poses das Nichts to the nothing as the proper setting, as it were, of metaphysics, since nothing cannot be objectified precisely because there is no thing. So building on everything you've been saying and his critique of this kind of seeming restriction, of philosophy to this ontotheology, he wants to move away from that, and this is why he brings up this question about the nothing. Could you maybe comment more on that?
His use of the word ontotheology. So ontos means being, right? Mm-hmm. And theos means like divine or God, right? Depending on how you're translating it, right? And so like ontology would just be like the study of being, right? And theology is the study of God. And so his issue, I think, funnily enough, the word ontotheology actually comes from Kant, but I think Heidegger changes the Kantian meaning fairly drastically. But his issue with, he basically says all philosophy has become ontotheology, right? And so basically, since the Greeks, right? He blames Plato for this too.
Wow.
And and so essentially what happens is, if you think of a lot of Plato's works or Aristotle's metaphysics or Thomas's 5 ways, right?
Yeah.
Well, I think if I understand Heidegger correctly, and I'm sure there would be Heidegger scholars who say, no, you do not understand him correctly, but right, is his issue is that when one starts thinking about being, right, mm-hmm. It seems as though every philosopher thus far in the tradition has ended up thinking about being ultimately as, right, like the divine or something like that. Right. In the metaphysics, Aristotle says, right, we're doing this study of being as being, but then ultimately he says this is theology. That's what Aristotle says, right? It's the first science. So I guess one could draw 2 conclusions from that. One would be the Heideggerian conclusion, which would be everybody's wrong, and we've constricted being to this concept we're calling God or divinity or something. The other conclusion one might reach is that maybe there's something to the fact that everybody's reached this conclusion, right? That once we trace the sources of being sort of back far enough, so to speak, we reach whatever we're calling God, to kind of paraphrase Thomas, right?
Yeah.
So, but again, for Heidegger, as I think you mentioned, right, there's this worry about restricting being to a concept, right? And so we're sort of taking being, right, that which is, and we're saying like, oh, its ultimate source is this concept we're calling God. And so for Heidegger, at least, the worry is constricting being. Now, of course, like Aristotle and Thomas and whoever, and Ulrich and other people and almost everybody else in the tradition would sort of say like, no, like that's not what's happening. But that's what Heidegger is sort of accusing everyone of doing.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So, so I think this is why he kind of turns to the thing that cannot be objectified, because it's not a thing, the nothing.
The nothing.
So as you point out in the article, right, Heidegger sees this phrase, how is it with the nothing, as the question of metaphysics. And you even point out in the article, there seems to be, as you already said, a kind of trajectory in Heidegger where at first he seems to be okay with metaphysics, but then he kind of moves away from that. But that's where he begins. And so the question would be, why begin with this question of how is it with the nothing, as opposed to what is nothing or what is being, and maybe nothing is like the negation of that. So why does he start there? I mean, we kind of already been talking about it, but is there anything else that jumps out?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, if metaphysics is, I mean, classically put, right, the study of being is being, right? Yeah. That's straight from Aristotle, right? Then Heidegger is very concerned with again, like I have an apple, right? And instead of like me, and again, I think there's something really legitimate here. Instead of me sort of like beholding the apple and sort of being like, oh, like, it's not just red. There's like a little bit of yellow in it, and there's some green in it, and like, instead of like letting the apple kind of like reveal itself to me, Heidegger would use the word unconceal. Instead of letting the apple unconceal itself to me, I just sort of like look at it and say, oh, that's an apple. And so I like bring it into line with my idea of what an apple is, and move on with my life. Right, rather than kind of sitting there with the apple and like letting it, again, to use Heideggerian language, like unconcealed.
Yeah.
So if that's what we're doing day to day with all the stuff around us, and again, I think that there's some legitimacy to this point, right? Then if we're doing metaphysics and we're studying being as being, right? Heidegger seems to think that what we're doing is we're bringing like being into line with our concept of being, so that then we don't have to sort of think more about it or behold it more or sit with it at all, right?
Yeah.
So, okay, so then how does one, like, how do we correct that, or how do we offer a corrective?
Yeah.
For Heidegger, I think the corrective is, well, instead of thinking about metaphysics as the study of being as being, instead, he says the question of metaphysics is, how is it with the nothing? So in German, it's wie steht das Nichts. And so like, and the reason I say that in German is because like another way to translate it might be sort of like, how does the nothing stand, or how stands it with the nothing? Like steht could be that way. Or stehen, right, is kind of like standing. So, or staying. Okay, so why ask how is it with the nothing, right? Because then we're not, I think he thinks we're less inclined to, or tempted to then sort of have this idea of being that we already think we know, and then like move on from it, but rather say, well, wait a second, like what is like being such that like I can never put my hands on being, right? Like I can never sort of like, well, why is it? Like, why is that the case? Well, because in some way being like is kind of like nothing itself, right?
Yeah, on its own, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, on its own, right? And so instead of asking like, or instead of studying like being as being, we're then asking like, what is this nothingness that we also seem to be dealing with when we're thinking about being?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Which is
and you said,
das Nichts. Yeah.
yeah, and you said one way to translate it would be to stay with the nothing, and that kind of feeds into his category of angst or anxiety, right?
Yeah.
Which is actually you want to stay with that feeling of ungraspability. Um, so let me just read. You have this kind of this explanation of what he means by angst.
Yeah.
You write, indetermination is its defining feature. It leads to feeling unheimlich. I think is that how you say it, or
Unheimlich.
uncanny? Yeah.
Unheimlich. Yeah.
Okay. Unheimlich. Okay. It is in this mood of anxiety that beings recede from us. We cannot quite get a hold of them. This recession is not a disappearance of beings, but an overall feeling of being unable to grasp beings. We can get no hold of things. This inability to grasp or hold onto beings results in anxiety. And as Heidegger puts it, anxiety makes manifest the nothing. So I find that really fascinating because it kind of, I mean, I can kind of relate to that experience, especially like when I'm out in nature and I'm looking at, things around me, and there's this kind of surreal moment of not taking things for granted and feeling kind of out of sorts, kind of not fitting in a certain way. Almost like, you have this image of like string theory of all these, things, these beings, like we really don't know what they are. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And yeah,
Yeah. There's I think there's a comedian named like Pete Davidson, I think is his name, and he has this bit where he's talking about like, yeah, everything's made up of atoms, and he's like, that makes no. I mean, he uses the F word, like that makes no freaking sense, right? Like, and then he's like, they tell us that the universe is expanding, like that makes no freaking sense, right? Like they tell us that like everything that we have, like, or that everything solid also has like a bunch of like, it's just mostly vacuums or mostly space. Like that makes no freaking sense. Like it's actually a pretty good bit, and because it really does, to me at least, demonstrate a little bit this kind of like, whoa, what is this world we live in, right? And I think it's true, even if, maybe in some ways science can kind of give us access to that mystery again, in a way, because it sort of reveals like how weird everything actually is, right? But I think you don't. It doesn't have to be through that pathway, of the scientific method or scientific knowledge, right? Like, to take my like stupid Apple example again, like I sort of look at it, and you're sort of like, wait a second, like this does look different than like every other Apple that I've ever encountered. Like, well then wait a second, like why can I call all of those things Apple if this is like so different from every other one, right? Like, is this? Yeah. And then there's, you sort of, I mean, again, there's a couple of different ways to go with that feeling, right? One is just like, oh, this is dumb, and like move on, right? Like, which like I've seen people do, like when you start asking questions like that, like people are like, I don't like, this is a dumb conversation, right? Yeah. Another option is to say, well, like, oh yeah, it is all meaningless, and we just like human beings just kind of like call all these things apples arbitrarily, or something like that, and like we're just the ones who like are placing meaning onto all of this stuff, but it's meaningless in itself. But the other direction, which I would say is sort of like the properly philosophical direction, is to like dive into that kind of discomfort, right? And be like, wait, why is this sort of disturbing to me, or what is this, right? I mean, and it, going away from Heidegger and going to Socrates, right? Like Socrates makes everybody uncomfortable by basically always asking the what is it question that everybody thinks they already know until they're faced with the question, right? And then he's like, no, but like really, like what is it? Like what is justice, or like what is love actually, or or like what is piety, Euthyphro, and then people get really uncomfortable. So the properly philosophic disposition is to push into that, right? And that's what Heidegger, I think, is trying to encourage, right? With this sort of like, well, why can't why can't I sort of fully know this stuff? Why can't I fully get to the bottom of what an apple is, right? And that, now for Heidegger, he says that produces angst or anxiety, right? And I'm not sure that it has to produce angst or anxiety. Right. I don't know if you want to go in that direction, but
yeah. Well, so I kind of wanted to narrow in a little bit on this, because I think it leads directly into this contradiction admitted by Heidegger, it seems to me, of the nothing and how did he put it? Let me go ahead and read what you put in the article real quick. You said Heidegger still asks how and not what, though anxiety makes the nothing manifest. It does not allow a definition, nor does it allow us to grasp or take hold of the nothing in any way. And so the nothing is that which cannot be grasped, that which makes beings ungraspable. So what's interesting to me is that it's precisely the nothing, this ungraspability, which kind of breaks our quote unquote domination through the concept, and then brings the thing back to us in a new way, where we have to kind of contend with it anew. But in Heidegger, it's almost like this ungraspability and this Dasein of the thing, right? Actually just revealed that these two things are contradictions, if that makes sense. Could you maybe unpack that a little bit more? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is where this was my issue with Heidegger, and I think Ulrich's issue too, or at least that's how I read Ulrich. But das Nichts, I mean, it's interesting that Heidegger, I mean, he literally says das Nichts, so he calls it the nothing, right? Das is the definite article in German.
Yeah.
So even in his articulation of the question, which he says is the question of metaphysics, he's already giving nothingness a kind of substantiality by calling it the nothing, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so it seems to me that while there is something true about things being ungraspable at bottom, right? Like I include a quote in that in that article. It's actually from Thomas Aquinas, that says, like, we can't even know everything there is to know about, like, a fly, actually, right? So while it is true that things are ungraspable at bottom, I think that point that Heidegger is trying to emphasize is correct. The way that he seems to explain it, at least as I read him, is by almost positing two sort of competing, or as you said, contradictory forces in things themselves.
Yeah.
The nothing and being, right? So he makes them so the sort of scholastic language is he reifies, he thingifies. The res is a thing. He reifies nothingness, right? And so instead of things simply being beings, right, and therefore, like, being's nature is to kind of communicate itself, right? There's this second, like, force almost, right, called the nothing in things, that then sort of makes what he says is makes beings withdraw from us too, right? So again, using my apple example, right, on the one hand, being, right, the being of the apple is communicating itself to me. So it's, again, to use Heidegger's language, it's unconcealing, and therefore I can know something about the apple. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there's this, again, I don't know what other word to call it other than a force, right, called das Nichts, that's sort of pulling the being of the apple away from me so that I can't completely sort of grasp it or dominate it, right? Yeah. And so that's where it seems to me, in reading What is Metaphysics, right, and also reading the intro and the postscript to it too, right, it does seem to me that it's hard to get away from their feeling like there's two contradictory forces in things, letting them unconceal, but then concealing them as well.
Yeah, yeah. That's fascinating. It's funny because the irony here seems to be that Heidegger falls back into the very critique he made by objectifying the nothing.
I think so.
So this is, I think, excellent, because you talked about angst, maybe there's another attitude, maybe it's wonder, and then you talked about this dualism in a certain sense of Dasein and Das Nichts. But Ulrich steps in, and I'd like to talk about him in just a second. And he steps in and he just he out Heideggers Heidegger
Yeah.
by going back to the tradition,
Right.
actually.
Right. Yeah.
So let me just conclude with this quote from your paper here. You say, in order for a being to be known anew, this is according to Heidegger, it must be annihilated. In order for annihilation not to be the last word on knowledge, beings must disclose themselves, and so on and so forth. All contradiction seems to disclose here is contradiction. So that's kind of the conclusion with Heidegger. There's this kind of, it's a flattening of the reality of things because of this dualism, is the way I read that. So maybe we could get into Ulrich. So who is this Ulrich guy? Why should people know about him?
Yeah, I have to answer this question all the time since he's not very well known. Yeah, so Ferdinand Ulrich was basically a generation after Heidegger. He actually died in February of 2020. He German philosopher, not nearly as well known as Heidegger, although I think ostensibly should be, and my hope is to contribute in that. But he's a Catholic philosopher. He was actually born in Czechoslovakia, but his family moved, and he lived a lot of his life in Bavaria. He was a friend and also sort of co-influence of Balthasar. That's sort of the point in history I kind of normally, or the historical figure I normally connect him to for people, right? Most people, if they're interested in Catholic theology, know who Hans Urs von Balthasar is. They should, at least. And so Balthasar thought of him as one of the greatest philosophers ever, which is, pretty high praise coming from Balthasar. And in particular, Balthasar wrote that Ulrich's book Homo Abyssus overcomes, one of the reasons it's so important is it overcomes what Balthasar called the baneful dualism between philosophy and theology. Homo Abyssus was Ulrich's first book, and the whole title is the drama of the question of being. So Homo Abyssus, the drama of the question of being. In German, the word that's translated drama is das Wagnis, and interestingly, drama is a perfectly fine translation of it, but Wagnis could also be translated risk. And so the subtitle of the book could also be translated the risk of the question of being, which I kind of like. Or at least, it's hard to communicate all nuances of a word in a different language. Translation is very difficult, but I like that tone, the risk of the question of being, because Ulrich is communicating there. It seems to me that being is not it's not just something that's given to us and then that's it. But that there's drama and there's risk involved in engaging with thinking about being. Homo Abyssus is a work of what Ulrich calls metaphysics and meta-anthropology. So the first half of the book is metaphysics, and then the second half of the book is basically based on all of the conclusions about metaphysics in the first half of the books. What does this mean for the being of man in particular, right? Meta-anthropology is what he calls it. In a way, we could say that Homo Abyssus is an engagement with primarily Hegel and Heidegger, but we could also say all of kind of modern philosophy and the questions of modern philosophy, an engagement with their questions from within the resources of the tradition, specifically and primarily Thomas Aquinas. So Ulrich, the reason I think he's so important and the reason I chose to write on him is because he's he's not afraid to look at the questions that modern philosophy sort of presents us. In fact, he looks at them squarely, in the eye and says, like, yes, like these questions are legitimate. And like the answers lie in this rich fountain that we call the tradition, actually. And I think that's really important, because I do think that a lot of Catholic philosophy kind of goes in one of two directions. Either it's like, we're just going to go back to the scholastics and sort of ignore that the modern era ever happened, right? Or, right, we're just going to ignore the scholastics and kind of do modern philosophy, but like with like sort of like Jesus sprinkles on top of it or something like that. And that's a Larry Chapp reference. But like, and what Ulrich does is like, no, like the questions of modern philosophy are incredibly important. We have to be able to answer them, but we don't answer them by abandoning, right, the resources that we have. We answer them by going back to them and going like more deep. Like, what these questions allow us to do is actually go more deeply into the tradition, into the resources of the tradition that maybe we have before. That's why I think
creatively retrieving.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I'm becoming very, very interested in Ulrich after reading your articles. I just started. I'm in the second chapter of David Schindler's introduction to Homo Abusus.
Yeah.
The companion book.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm taking it in slowly, but I'm loving it. Yeah.
One must.
Yeah. So this is interesting because Ulrich focuses on the real distinction in St. Thomas. If I'm not mistaken, Balthasar called the real distinction like one of the most important events in the history of philosophy.
Yeah.
And so he focuses on this text in De Potentia, I think it is, where St. Thomas is talking about created being, created esse. And Thomas writes that created esse is basically complete and simple, but non-subsistent. So completum et simplex sed non subsistens. And let me just read another quote from your article, and then you can open it up for us. You write, being is nothing other than self-diffusing actuality, but it does not subsist as a thing between God and the creature. Thomas therefore says, esse signifies something complete and simple, but non-subsistent. As pure mediation, to be is not an existing thing, an ens in the scholastic language. So this is fascinating, right? Because I have in my mind this picture of the full act of being, right? But it not existing because, when you say like an apple exists, in a certain sense, it's something that exists, and existing is the predicate. But existing doesn't exist on its own unless it's ipsum esse subsistens, God himself, right? So esse creatum is non-subsistence, and yet it is complete and full. And so there's this nothing, it doesn't exist, and there's the fact that it's complete and full actuality. And so here, what's interesting is that, as we were talking about earlier with Heidegger, with his dualism, Ulrich just says created being is nothing. I find that crazy. In a good way, but could you maybe unpack that?
Crazy in a good way. Yeah. So, what does it mean that created being is nothing? So, as you said, right, it's just to because it is such a crazy in a good way point. Esse creatum, right, created being, right. Just to make one minor correction with what you were saying, it exists, it doesn't subsist, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So there's not this like this is what Ulrich called. He uses the language of temptation a lot throughout Homo Abusus, especially throughout. But in the first part, he talks about the temptations of thought a lot, and essentially he says like the temptation of thought is to turn being into a thing, to reify being, right?
Yeah.
So God gives the gift of being, right? Or God creates by giving the gift of being is probably a better way of putting that. And our, like, the temptation of thought is to think of, like, so you've got God and the world, and then there's this like cloudy thing between the two of us called created being, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which, if that were the case, essentially that would be a demiurge. It would be a third thing between God and the world, right? Actually. But no, that's not what happens. There's no, I mean, that's sort of like the most amazing, wonderful thing about the doctrine of creation, right? There isn't this mediator between God and the world, right? He like, mm-hmm. The whole reason for positing the mediator in all these other different traditions is so that, like, God doesn't have to, like, get his hands dirty, right? With this thing called, like, with materiality. But that's not the case. God creates out of nothing, right? There is no, like, mediator between the Most High God and us. It's just God and us, right? So God creates by giving the gift of being. So being exists, and Thomas is super, super clear about that, right? And one of the reasons we can say that, I just want to cover all my bases metaphysically here, but well, okay, like I exist, right? Like my mug exists, right? Like you exist, right? We all have this thing called, we all have this power called existence, right? Mm-hmm. Like all of us, and it takes some effort to stay in existence, right? Like we know that because there were things that were once in existence that aren't anymore. So, like, it's actually like an activity, right? Like, to stay in existence, right? Like, it takes effort to stay in existence. But so there's this commonality between all of us, existence, but we're different things, right? Like, I'm not you, I'm not this mug, right? So we all have this activity of existence. We're all exerting this activity of existence, and yet, right, we're all different, right? So there has to be this common activity, right? Mm-hmm. Common actuality, right? That's existence itself, right? Which is another way of translating essay, right? Yeah. So God creates by giving the gift of being, right? Or another way to translate essay is being, right? The to be of things, the being of things, right? So God creates by giving the gift of being, right? But he doesn't do it through, like, he doesn't, like, make a thing called being that then creates the world, right? He actually gives his creatures being, right? He actually, and that's like the most amazing thing about the doctrine of creation, right? Like, he gives it to us, right? Yeah. So if being were a thing, right, it would mean that God didn't actually give it to his creatures. He didn't sort of trust us with it, or he didn't want to get his hands dirty, as I kind of said before, right? What he does is he gives creatures this activity of being, this activity of existence, right? Mm-hmm. And he really gives it to them. So existence really does exist, but it doesn't exist as a thing in and of itself. There's no, like, bubble of existence that then, like, when I come into being, I, like, grab a piece of, or something like that, right? Yeah. So because of that, right, created being, says Thomas Aquinas, is complete and simple, right? Like, God really does give the gift of being completely, right? And he does it in one act, right? Now, to us, obviously, that's part of it. Yeah. Exactly. For us, like, on our side of things, it's obviously over time. It looks like over time, right? But God's not in time, right? So God does it completely. He, like you just said, he's not giving, like, pieces here and there, and he does it, and it's given simply, meaning that it's given all at once, right? Mm-hmm. But it's not a thing in and of itself, right? So then Thomas says, so it's complete and simple, but it's non-subsistent, right? We're the things that subsist. Right? Yeah. Essay doesn't subsist.
Yeah. No, that's very helpful. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting is that in the article, you kind of continue by showing that, therefore, Ulrich points to this other text in Thomas where he says that esse is similitudo divinae bonitatis. So it's the image of the divine goodness. And so let me just quote here. You say it is it is in the nature of the good to be generous, to give itself away. Goodness is always naturally generous, never jealously clings to itself. Thus, the perfection of created esse entails its non-subsistence, its nothingness. And its non-subsistence is what allows beings to be and to be revealed at all. So this is interesting because with Heidegger, we're talking about das Nicht as being what recedes the thing so that it might be revealed, but there's a bit of a contradiction with his dualism. Here, precisely because created being does not subsist, it actually is able to reveal itself to us. Could you maybe comment more about how that works?
Yeah, I mean, another way of putting that is maybe that because created being doesn't subsist, and all created being does is allow other things to subsist, right? Is
Other things are revealed. Yeah, yeah.
Then what created being does is it allows us to reveal ourselves, right? And all creatures to reveal themselves, right?
Yeah. Makes
So
sense.
like the gift, what God gives in giving being is the logic of giving, right?
Mm-hmm.
And or like the logic of communication, right? He communicates, right, being, right? And in that communication, then therefore like the logic of giving to others or revealing to others is already in there. So as I was saying before, like we all have this power of existence, this effort to stay in existence. Well, part of that effort to stay in existence is also always like communicating myself to others, right? Like, like
Yeah.
I forget where Thomas says it, but Thomas basically says like if a thing's not communicating itself, then it doesn't exist. Is
Yeah.
Thomas says, and so rather than needing to say, right, that things reveal themselves and then sort of pull themselves away in order that they might be revealed anew, according to Heidegger, Ulrich looks at this differently and says, well, wait a second, there's an infinite source of our being that's allowing us all to reveal ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that's the sort of source of the ungraspability rather than a kind of like pulling back or something like that.
Yeah. So in other words, use the word, Ulrich's word of not annihilation, like Heidegger said, but transnihilation,
Right.
which is it's interesting. It's almost like Jacob's ladder. You have the non-subsistence on one side and the completum et simplex on the other side, both sides of being and of created being. Yeah, I mean, so with, reading through your article, I mean, I had all these thoughts about if created being is a gift, then that implies a recipient, a kind of ultimate recipient, probably, that can respond, right? And I mean, this gets theological. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the role of the Blessed Virgin Mary precisely as a woman, as the kind of the other, God is father, not mother, because this kind of pantheistic temptation of immanentizing everything. But if Mary is the woman, in a certain sense, she's the because I'm having a hard time express this, but in David Schindler's book, in Dr. Schindler's book, he talks about in the act of creation, it's the created being is given, but also essence, the reception of created being is given within the act of creation. And so it seems to be that there's the being and the capacity to receive being and the response, all of that is given in the act of creation. I mean, it's very Marian. I'm thinking of the Annunciation and this idea of daughter Zion. She kind of recapitulates all of the people of God, literally this kind of dramatic encounter of the freedom of the creature. Anyway, so this is kind of where my mind is going when thinking about all this stuff. So
yeah, I mean, you're not wrong. Ulrich would agree with you completely, right? He doesn't say it as much in Homo Boetis because, I mean, especially because Homo Boetis is sort of very much a philosophical work. But I mean, in other places, he absolutely affirms that Mary, in a certain way, how do I want to put this? Is the apex of the logic of creation, right? By
Yeah.
which I mean, she receives, but she doesn't receive for herself, right?
Yeah.
She receives to then give, right? And in a certain way, she like gives God back to himself, which is like,
Oh,
yeah, right. But she receives to give to all of us, right? To the rest of creation as well, right? So if I mean, again, because I mean, the logic of creation. I mean, most of my academic career has basically, in one way or another, just been about sort of thinking about creation, right? And the metaphysics of creation. But the logic of creation is such that, right? I mean, if we take creation ex nihilo seriously, which I think obviously we have to, right? Then God doesn't create out of some need to subdue chaos, as so many of those kind of like older myths, right? God also doesn't create out of some lack, like in order to fulfill some lack in himself, right? Okay, so if it's not either of those things, then what, like, why does he create? Well, like the answer is basically because like he wants another to exist, right? Like he wants he wants an other to himself to exist. That's the logic of creation, right? Like that's the logic of being, is to allow the other to be.
Yeah.
Right? So then Mary, go ahead.
No, please continue. Yeah.
Mary, then she incarnates that most perfectly, right? Because she receives her being, right? But then like all that reception, right? Like all it's for is for the other to be, right? And for that other to be perfect and free as well.
Yeah. No, that's beautiful. I mean, I feel like another aspect of this is that if created being is non-subsistent, and that actually points to the fact that it is other than God, right? It's not subsistent being. Then that kind of letting be, that release. I mean, Ratzinger talks a lot about the idea of creation being not a kind of idealism where everything's in the mind of God, nor a materialism where there is no God. Mind kind of emerges through a process of evolution, but rather everything coming from the mind of God, but being released into a kind of independence of its own, and therefore that being the ground of its freedom. And so the conclusion I'm drawing from this is that it's precisely this metaphysics of creation which accounts for the freedom and the otherness of creation, but that seems to reflect, that needs to come from somewhere, that freedom. And so obviously I'm thinking of the freedom within God. And so how could this understanding of creation metaphysically help us understand God and his own freedom? I mean, obviously it's ungraspable. If anything was ungraspable, that would be it. But what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, again, I mean, in a certain way, starting from the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, right? Like, then as I sort of traced out before, then if you thinking through the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, you have to ultimately say like the logic of creation is, or that creation came to be because God wants another to be. Okay, well then the next sort of further back question is like, well, why would God? What is this God? What is the nature of God, this God, that he would want another to be, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, you could spend your whole life thinking about just that question, but like just to offer an initial answer, if it suggests that there's already otherness in God, it seems to me, right? Because like, why would it, like, I mean, it's such a bad way to put this, but like, why would it occur to God to want another to be unless there was already a kind of otherness within himself, right? Which I mean, a better way of putting that might be, why would God see otherness as good unless he already knew otherness as good?
Yeah.
and obviously now we have the doctrine of the Trinity, so it's sort of like quote unquote easy for me to say that, right? But I do think it helps us make sense of the two doctrines together, right? Like, why does God think otherness is good such that he wants an other to himself to be? Well, because there's already a kind of otherness within himself, right? And he knows that to be good already. It seems to me. I think that's at least one way to start to unpack that.
Unpack it. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that more. No, what I find so interesting about this is that precisely Heidegger's critique of ontotheology or Roman thinking, he falls. It seems, I mean, from reading your article, he seems to fall right back into it, precisely because he's not attached to the real tradition. I made a joke one time to I was talking. C.S. Lewis has this quote about pagan, pagan philosophy as being kind of like a virgin that hasn't been betrothed, and then modern philosophy kind of being like a divorcee. Although I think Lewis might have been talking about religion or just whatever. But the point, though, is I kind of made a joke. I said Heidegger sounds like someone who didn't like his wife and shot her, and then realized that the marriage wasn't valid to begin with anyway. So basically, if you go back to Thomas and you look at what he's saying, he's not all kind of constricting things to concepts and saying the mind and the reality are equal and that's all there is to it. And that's why I've been reading a lot of Blondel recently, and he seems to want to move out of that kind of constricting way of thinking and focus on real knowledge of action, this kind of freedom and in your choices. And so anyway, so I'm just seeing all these connections, and Ulrich seems to be right in the middle of this whole conversation, if that makes sense.
I think so. In fact, well, a couple of notes, right? Like, number one, one must wonder, like, what version of Thomas Heidegger was taught, right? Like, if he got a sort of super manual version of Thomas, you can see why he kind of like reacted against it, right? Like, I also react against manualistic Thomas, right? Now the thing is, like, then I kind of want to say to him, like, you were smart enough to see past that, right. But whatever. So but you do want to at least contextualize a little bit, like, what's going on there. Heidegger's also writing in a time where we've got the rise of technology. And so he's seeing kind of in real time what it means to, like, literally objectify things, right? And knowledge being just how to use something, right? Like, and so we have to, I have to sort of, I mean, he has a very famous essay called The Question Concerning Technology, where he expresses a lot of these problems. And again, like, this is why I think, like, we actually have to, like, be grateful to Heidegger, right? In a certain way. I lost my second point. So the Heidegger, so I wanted to talk about Heidegger, and then what else did you say? At the center. Yeah. Well, so the Blondel point, I actually, in my dissertation, had a really long footnote about kind of comparing Blondel and Heidegger. Now, again, like, not Heidegger, Blondel and Ulrich. Right. I'm not a Blondel scholar in any way, but what's interesting to me is both Blondel and Ulrich are very clear that they are philosophers, and that these works are works of philosophy, right? Yeah. But what that doesn't mean, and unfortunately, this is what especially, like, modern philosophy came to mean, essentially, like, well, you can't talk about God, or it doesn't count as philosophy anymore. And both Blondel and Ulrich reject that, right? Now you don't start with God, right? You start with the kind of data of reality, and you move, and for Ulrich, you do that with being. For Blondel, you do that with action, right? But what they don't do is foreclose at the beginning against transcendence, right? And so which, by the way, like, Neither did Plato, neither did Aristotle.
Yeah.
Like, it was only, and this is why, again, I think Balthazar says about Homo abyssus that it overcomes the baneful dualism between philosophy and theology. I think what he means by that is this like foreclosure at the beginning against any
A
transcendent.
priori. Yeah.
Exactly.
Self philosophy. Blondel really fought against that. Yeah.
Exactly. And so I think in that way your linking of Blondel and Ulrich is very astute, because both of them are trying to reject a certain scholastic, neo-scholastic, manualistic, however you want to put it, version of philosophy that's kind of been handed down as the tradition, right? At the same time, also rejecting this modern notion that like to do philosophy means to foreclose against transcendence.
Yeah.
And so I think both of them in that sense are embarking on a similar project, although obviously in kind of different directions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's so interesting seeing all the influences. I mean, Ulrich influences Balthasar and vice versa, but also like, de Lubac influences Balthasar, and de Lubac himself influenced by Blondel.
Yeah.
And I mean, these are the questions: philosophy, theology, faith, reason, nature, grace. I mean, it seems to be the modern question, right?
I think so.
And I mean, going back to St. Thomas, and I'll let you go here soon, but going back to St. Thomas himself, right, with the introduction of Aristotle as this, because I was reading some Pieper on this, Joseph Pieper, and he points to the fact that unlike previously through Boethius or others, we're not talking about a text from Aristotle being introduced and incorporated. We're talking about a whole corpus, a whole worldview, a whole separate worldview being introduced into the Middle Ages. And Thomas has to negotiate these rival camps in a certain sense. And what he turns to is the doctrine of creation.
Mm-hmm.
And I just find that so interesting.
It's amazing.
And yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
And well, I mean, so I don't know if you know the name Norris Clark at all, but
yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
Norris Clark is really good on this stuff, I think. Probably one of the best. Him and Whipple, probably. Because what they say is like, what Thomas finds in the doctrine of creation is like the path to recovering a lot of the Aristotelian understanding of things, but also being able to sort of combine is not a great word, but synthesize is probably a better word, that with the Neoplatonic understanding of participation. And it's beautiful what Thomas does with that.
It's just incredible. Yeah. No, because I know I too kind of have been exposed to this, what they call Aristotelico-Thomism, or however they call it, and it kind of essentializes things, and there's a kind of extrinsicism. And
there's a tendency, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to be too harsh on it, but that's and so kind of going back to the text of Thomas, Norris Clark was hugely influential. I mean, I read The One and the Many, and it just opened up Thomas like in a way that I didn't know was possible. And I mean, there really is this Thomas isn't just taking Aristotle, as Chesterton says, he's baptizing him, and baptism is death to the old man, a breaking apart and a re-putting back together, the new man. And that's really important to know, I think. So
I agree. Yeah. And again, just to go back to one of your earliest questions, like I think this is another reason why Ulrich is so important, because he's recovering precisely that Thomas. And I think that's an incredibly important for our moment right now.
And it seems that he's doing it very creatively. He's not slavishly following the text. He's actually like taking in some of the things that Heidegger is saying and Hegel.
Oh, absolutely. Well, because how do you get Thomas to answer Heidegger? The only way you can get Thomas to answer Heidegger is like by actually like sort of living and breathing Thomas, right? And like really sort of integrating him such that you could, because Thomas didn't deal with the questions that Heidegger gave us, but like, and yet like Ulrich is able to do that because he's such a master at Thomas's corpus, and I think really has him sort of like breathed him in, and he's incredibly important for that reason as well.
I think I'm just so interested in Ulrich, and I think because I was reading one of your articles, I think it was on fairy tales, his commentary on fairy, and then there's the Prodigal Son, his commentary on that. I mean, this is amazing. I don't know why more people aren't talking about this stuff.
I'm doing my best.
Oh man. Awesome. Well, it's been an hour and 5 minutes, so I better let you go. But it's been a joy to talk about Ulrich with you, and I'm trying to be more familiar with him. And I'm trying to get other people to be interested as well, because everything I've seen so far is that this actually is a very important writer, and we really do need to talk about him. So
All right. Well, thank you.
awesome. Well, audience, if you enjoy these kinds of conversations, make sure you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell. You can support the Logos Project at patreon.com/the Logos Project. And so without further ado, we'll see you all next time. God bless everybody. Thanks, Dr. Coleman.
Thank you.